Montana Territory. May 1879, the boy was barefoot and bleeding when Odessa Vaughn found him along the tree line behind her cabin, his ribs showing through a torn shirt and a welt rising high across one cheek. She dropped the pail of water she had been carrying. "Where's your mama, sweetheart?" The child flinched when she knelt. "Gone." Odessa's heart buckled. She reached out slow, letting him see her empty hands. "What's your name, Orin?" he whispered. She took him in her arms and carried him inside. The boy could not have been older than 8, and Odessa knew right away he had been beaten. That welt was no fall. She cleaned his face, wrapped him in a quilt, and fed him leftover beans and cornbread while the sun dropped behind the pines. That night, as Orin slept curled up like a pup on her cot, Odessa sat at the table staring at the broken skin on his back. She had seen men do terrible things before, including to her, but never to a child. Not like this. The next morning, Orin woke screaming. She rushed to calm him, brushing hair off his forehead. "Was it your father?" she asked gently once he settled. He nodded, her stomach turned. "And your mama?" "Dead." She pressed a hand over her mouth. Odessa had lived alone since her brother died in a mining collapse 2 years ago. She had no children of her own, no husband. But now this boy was here, and she knew she could not take him to the sheriff. The law was too slow, too blind, and too loyal to the wrong men. She knew who Orin's father was before the boy even said the name Clayton Ridge. A man with land, money, and friends on the county board. A man who could get away with murder and likely had. Odessa stood and packed a sack. She would not let that man put hands on the boy again. By noon, she had Orin bundled up on a borrowed mule headed northeast, toward the Bitterroots. She had an old friend up that way, a woman with a kind heart and a quiet cabin tucked into the trees. It would take days, but she could hide Orin there. They moved at night and kept to the ridges. Odessa avoided towns. She sold her brooch for food and stitched Orin's shirt with thread from her hem. Every step deepened her resolve. On the 5th night they were spotted. She heard the hooves before she saw the lanterns. 3 riders, rifles slung. She grabbed Orin and ran into the trees. Gunfire cracked the stillness. She ducked low, heart thundering. A bullet struck a tree behind her. She pushed Orin ahead. "Run, baby, just run." They scrambled down a ravine, slid through brush, and crossed a shallow creek. Her boots filled with mud, her skirt tore. She kept going. A rider caught up near dawn. Odessa turned and fired her pistol, once missed, and then the man lunged from his horse and dragged her down. She fought like hell, his hand clamped over her mouth. "You think you can steal my boy, you filthy," a shot rang out behind them. The man froze. Blood bloomed across his chest, hot and fast. He dropped beside her. Odessa blinked, gasping. A tall figure stepped out from the trees, rifle still drawn. Young, broad-shouldered, dust-covered. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his voice was clear. "You all right, ma'am?" She stared up at him, stunned. "Who are you?" "Name's Porter Whitlow." He looked at her, then the boy crouched behind a tree, shaking. "You two better come with me," he said. They rode with him to a nearby cabin nestled in the hills, far from any road. Porter gave Orin a blanket and an apple, then turned to Odessa. "You want to tell me why Clayton Ridge's men are chasing you?" She looked at the fire. "Because I took his boy, after what he did to him." Porter's jaw worked. "The bruises," she nodded. He sat quiet for a long time, watching the flames. Then he said, "You did right." She blinked back tears. "They will not stop. They will find us again." "Not while you are under my roof." She looked at him then. Really looked. He was young, maybe 28, his hands rough from work, his eyes steady. Odessa felt something loosen in her chest, something she had not felt in years: safety. For the first time in days, she slept without waking in terror. The next morning, he was outside splitting wood when she stepped out with coffee. He took the tin cup from her, their fingers brushing. "You got someone who will come looking for you?" he asked. "No. You got any family?" "None left." He looked at her. "Then you are not alone anymore," she swallowed. "Why are you helping us?" His gaze held hers. "Because someone should." She realized then how much sorrow was hiding behind his calm. And she wondered what he had lost to make him care so easily about a stranger. That day, he taught Orin how to set a rabbit snare. Odessa watched them from the porch, heart aching and swelling all at once. That night, she sat beside Porter on the steps, the stars bright above. He passed her a blanket. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" he asked. She shook her head. "This is all I know," he nodded. "Me too." They sat in silence, shoulders close. The next morning she woke to gunfire not far. Porter was already on his feet, reaching for his rifle. "Keep the boy inside." She grabbed Orin and ducked behind the table as he stepped out. Two men were coming up the path. One had the same Ridge badge on his coat. Odessa's breath caught. Porter shouted, "You ride back and tell Clayton if he sends another man, I will bury him myself." One of them raised a pistol. Porter fired first. The man fell. The second fled. Porter stood still for a moment, chest heaving. Then he came back inside. Odessa looked at him, heart pounding. "I cannot let you keep risking yourself for us," she said. He stepped close, his voice low. "You already risked everything for that boy. My turn." Their eyes locked. The air between them changed. Porter touched the side of her face. "You are not alone anymore, Odessa." She leaned into his hand. Neither of them moved. The snow came early to the high country that year. By the second week of October, the wind had teeth, and the pines groaned under a weight they hadn't carried in years. Porter had split enough wood to last through winter, though he'd taken to checking the stacks each morning as if sheer worry could stretch them longer. Inside, the cabin held warmth. Odessa was on her knees near the hearth, coaxing a stew from what remained of the smoked elk Porter had brought down 2 weeks back. Orin sat cross-legged on the floor, carving a piece of pine with a dull knife Porter had blunted for him. The boy hadn't spoken much since the last men came looking. But he'd stopped flinching when Porter walked past, and that felt like something. Porter leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "He's got good hands." Odessa didn't turn. "He's got good in him, just needs time." The silence stretched, not strained, just full. Porter crossed the room, pulled a chair near the fire. "Heard from a trapper down the South Bend," he said finally. "Said Ridge was seen riding west with 2 wagons and a pair of drovers, heading out past the big hole." She stirred the pot slowly. "Running, maybe. Or maybe he's just shifting ground." Her eyes stayed on the flame. "Won't matter, he'll ride till he finds someone else too small to fight him. That's what men like that do." He didn't disagree. That night, after Orin had curled up with the pup, Porter had found him half-starved. One-eyed, loyal Odessa stepped outside. The moon hung low and orange over the hills, and the cold bit straight through her shawl. She didn't hear Porter until his boots crunched behind her. He stopped beside her, hands deep in his coat. "You always come out when the sky looks like that?" "Only when I can't sit still." He looked out over the dark trees. "You miss your brother?" The question struck low. "Every day," he nodded once. "Mine died in a fire out near Miles City." "We weren't close, but still leaves a mark." She glanced sideways. "You never said you had family." "I didn't. Not really. He was older, left home before I was out of short pants. But I followed him west, thinking maybe we'd find a way to make something of ourselves." "Did you?" "Not the way I thought." She turned to him then. "You ever think of leaving, going someplace no one knows your name?" "I did once. Got as far as the Wyoming border, but the land out here. It holds me." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I belong anywhere anymore." "You do," he said, quiet. "Right here." Her breath caught. He didn't reach for her, just stood there, his words hanging in the cold between them. The next morning brought fresh tracks in the snow. Not from horses, but a single set of boots, light, quick and careful. Porter followed them to the edge of the clearing, then lost them where the creek had frozen over. He came back tense, jaw set. Odessa met him at the door. "You found something?" "Someone's been watching the cabin." Not one of Ridge's men. Boots were too small. "Could be a scout, could be a drifter. I'll set traps along the ridge." She nodded. "What should we do in the meantime?" "Keep quiet. Stay close." By sundown, he'd laid tripwires through the brush and set bells along the north wall. Odessa kept Orin inside, teaching him how to thread a needle, her voice low, even. That night, after Orin was asleep, Porter sat by the fire with a rifle across his lap. Odessa poured 2 tin cups of boiled chicory and handed him one. He took it, fingers brushing hers. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "I could build on the east side of the cabin, make another room, give the boy his own space." Her eyes lifted. "You mean? For good? I don't reckon you've got anywhere else to be, and it seems to me he's already looking to you like a mama." Her hand trembled slightly. "And you," he met her gaze. "I reckon I've been looking at you like you belong here." A long silence. Then she said, "I never thought I'd find peace again." "You didn't," he said. "You made it." The fire cracked. She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't let go. Porter had cleared the grove east of the cabin by the time the ground began to thaw. It was slow work, frozen roots, stubborn earth, but he didn't rush. Each swing of the axe, each hauled log, seemed to settle something in him. Odessa watched from the porch some mornings, a cup warming her hands, while Orin crouched nearby, sketching the new room's outline in the dirt with a stick. The boy had started talking more. Not much, but enough. He asked about trees, about how far the stars went, about whether wolves ever came down this low. Porter answered everything simply, as if he'd been waiting for years to be asked. By early April, the first beams of the addition were raised. Odessa helped where she could, hauling stones for the stove base, hammering nails with steady rhythm. On one such afternoon, as she passed him a bucket of lime wash, Porter looked up at her with a kind of quiet weight in his eyes. "You ever think about what kind of life you'd want if things had gone different?" She rested the bucket on the porch rail. "I used to. Doesn't do much good now." "But if you could name it," she considered, then answered, "a place where no one's waiting to take what's mine. Work that matters. A child laughing under my roof. Someone to sit beside at the end of the day who doesn't take more than he gives." Porter nodded. "That sounds like something a man ought to be proud to help build." She tilted her head. "And what about you?" "I never thought too far ahead, but these last months. I've started thinking I'd like to be still for once, not always looking back or over my shoulder." That evening, while Orin slept curled with his pup near the hearth, Odessa sat with Porter on the porch. The sky had turned that pale violet it only did in spring, and sap was running in the trees again. "You gonna stay through summer?" she asked. He didn't look over. "I wasn't planning to go." The breeze shifted. She leaned a little closer, the warmth of his shoulder just brushing hers. Later that week, Porter took Orin out past the creek line to teach him about trapping sign. Odessa stayed behind to mend the torn hem of her only good dress, the one she hadn't worn since before her brother died. When they returned, Orin had a bundle of fiddleheads and a grin that didn't seem borrowed from anyone else's face. Porter handed her a tin of dried berries. "Thought you might put these in your bread." She took them carefully. "They're wild currants." Boy spotted them. Sharp eyes. She looked at Orin. "You want to help me bake?" His head bobbed. "Can we make the kind with sugar on top if we have enough to spare?" Porter chuckled, low and easy. "I'll chop extra wood to earn it." The days grew longer. Odessa planted potatoes and beans behind the cabin. Porter cleared more land for a small corral. Orin built a lean-to for the pup and named it Hickory. The rhythm of life grew steady, like a song that didn't need words. One evening in late May, as they sat around a modest supper, Porter set down his fork midway through a bite. "I got a letter," he said. Odessa looked up, surprised. "From who?" "A man I used to ride with out of Fort Shaw. He's running a lumber camp now up near Sealy Lake. Said he's got steady work, good pay." She waited. "He offered me a place. Says I could bring anyone I choose." Orin's gaze flicked between them. Odessa's voice was even. "You thinkin' to go?" Porter's eyes met hers. "I'm thinkin' I don't want to go anywhere unless you and the boy come with me." The room was so quiet even the pup didn't stir. She folded her hands in her lap. "You'd want that, all of it," he nodded. "I already do." Orin stood, scraping his chair back. "Would there be trees there, bigger than these?" Porter smiled. "Taller than the chimney." The boy grinned. Odessa stood slowly. "Then I suppose we should start packing." Porter rose too, and for the first time he reached for her hand, not in comfort or reassurance but in quiet promise. She let her fingers curl into his, unflinching. That night, Odessa lay awake beside the fire, watching the shadows from the flames dance along the beams. The cabin had been her sanctuary, her hiding place, her shelter. But now it was only part of the journey. She turned over, just enough to see Porter's back rising and falling in sleep beside her. The boy, safe and dreaming, lay in the new room still smelling of pine and fresh sawdust. She closed her eyes and exhaled. She hadn't just saved a child, she'd been saved too. By the time the tobacco leaves in the valley below turned gold, Porter had finished fashioning a wagon bed sturdy enough to carry their few belongings, and light enough for a single team to pull through mountain terrain. Odessa stitched canvas into a cover, her fingers raw from the needle but steady all the same. Orin helped gather pine gum for sealing the seams, his hands busy, his eyes brighter these days. They planned to leave at first thaw. The trail north would be rough, but Porter knew the way and had marked out the river crossings on a rough scrap of oilcloth. Odessa packed flour, salt, and the last of their dried venison into a pair of burlap sacks, making peace with what they'd leave behind the cradle Porter had carved for Hickory, the kettle with the dented rim, the chair her brother once sat in every morning. Porter found her beside the brook one afternoon, kneeling with her skirts gathered, rinsing the tin basin. The sun caught in her hair, and for a moment he didn't speak. She looked up. "You're quiet. Been thinking." She poured the last of the water downstream. He knelt beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "What kind of man I want to be once we're settled, not just someone who can build a roof or shoot straight, but someone who can give you more than safety." Odessa's brow furrowed. "You've given me more than most ever tried," he shook his head. "That's not the measure I want to be held to." She didn't answer for a long moment. Then, softly, "What are you afraid of, Porter?" He drew a line through the dirt with a stick. "That you'll wake one morning and remember all the things you lost, and wonder if I was just a stop along the way." "You're not a stop," she said. "You're the reason I kept going." He let the words settle. Then, gently, "Come with me, not just to Sealy Lake, come with me properly." "As my wife." Odessa's breath caught. "You're sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything." She reached for his hand without hesitation. "Then I will." 3 days later, they rode into the logging camp just as the snowmelt turned the trail to mud. The foreman, a wiry man with a northern accent and a crooked grin, welcomed them with a clap to Porter's shoulder and a place to sleep until Porter could raise a proper cabin. Odessa set about making the small space theirs. She washed the walls with vinegar and boiled spruce needles in tin pots to chase out the damp. Orin made fast friends with a boy named Eli, the son of a Finnish sawyer, and came home each evening with his boots caked in sawdust and his cheeks flushed from running. Porter worked long hours felling trees and hauling timber, but never came home late enough to miss supper. He brought Odessa a handful of wood violets one evening, his hands still stained from bark. She pressed them between pages of an old ledger, the only book her brother ever owned. They married beneath a stand of tamaracks that May, with Orin holding the ring and Eli's father playing a fiddle so old it sounded like the wind through pine. Porter wore his work shirt and Odessa her plain blue dress, the hem mended one last time. After the vows, they didn't kiss for show. He leaned in slow, his hand at the small of her back, and she met him with all the steadiness she had learned to carry. The camp grew quiet, the way it does when something honest is happening. By summer's end, Porter had built a home with wide windows and a porch just deep enough for 2 chairs. Odessa planted yarrow and sage near the steps, and Orin strung a line of feathers he'd found in the woods from one post to another. One night, as thunder rolled in slow from the west, Odessa stood at the door, watching lightning flicker beyond the pines. Porter came up behind her, resting his palm on her shoulder. She leaned back into him without a word. "You ever think," he said, "how one choice can change the shape of everything?" She nodded. "I think about it every time I look at that boy asleep in his bed." He kissed her temple. "You saved him," she turned. "You saved us." "No," he said. "We saved each other." Outside, the storm broke, but inside, the house held steady. Odessa closed the door and Porter slid the bolt into place. Then he turned to her and she to him, and in that quiet, rain-laced moment, there was nothing left to run from and everything left to build. The lake thawed late that year. Ice cracked like distant musket fire across the surface well into April, and the mornings kept their bite long past when they ought to have softened. Porter rose early as always, and by the time Odessa pulled her shawl over her shoulders, she could hear the rasp of his hands sharpening the drawknife out back. Inside, she fed the stove and stirred the last of the cornmeal into a pan, listening to the kettle hiss. Orin had scratched his name into the windowsill beside his cot, and she ran her fingers across it absently, smiling. The boy had grown taller through winter, his sleeves now too short, and his voice deeper than she expected when he spoke just after waking. She called him for breakfast, and he came yawning, tugging a wool sock over a heel. "Illy says there's an eagle's nest above the far bluff," he said. "Says you can see clear to the valley if you climb high enough. You'll take Porter with you if you go," she said, setting the plate in front of him. "The thaws made the slope slick. I can climb. I know. But I'd rather not have you proving it on broken legs," he grinned, already chewing. He already said he'd come. By midday, the sun settled warm between the peaks, and the three of them walked the trail past the mill, following a game path that narrowed the farther they went. Porter carried the pack slung over one shoulder and Orin darted ahead, calling out where the moss grew thickest and where the deer prints dipped into soft earth. When they reached the bluff, Orin climbed first, quick and sure. Porter followed with slower, measured steps, offering a steadying hand when Odessa reached the steepest part. She didn't need it, not truly, but she took it anyway. From the top, the valley spread out in golds and greens, the river glinting like a seam of silver thread. The eagle's nest sat high in a pine, and the bird itself wheeled once overhead before vanishing into the blue. Orin crouched near the edge, quiet. "Do you think my mama would have liked it here?" Odessa knelt beside him. "I think she'd be proud you made it here." He nodded once, then leaned into her side. Porter stood just behind, watching them both, and when Odessa looked back at him, she saw something in his face that hadn't been there before, not just contentment, but certainty. That evening, Porter laid the last beam for the storage shed he'd been building behind the cabin. Odessa brought him water and a cloth for his hands, and as he sat on the threshold, she knelt to wipe the dirt from his knuckles. "You ever wish you'd taken the foreman's offer to run the crew?" she asked, wringing the cloth out. "I thought about it," he said, "but I like knowing whose roof I'm under, and I like having supper with my wife more than I'd like holding someone else's ledger." She traced a line along his wrist. "You've made more of this place than I ever imagined anyone could. We did it together." Later, after Orin had gone to bed with a book of old stories borrowed from Ellie's father, Odessa sat beside Porter on the porch, the night soft and quiet around them. No lanterns burned in the nearby cabins. It was the kind of hush that came only when no one needed anything more. "I've been thinking," she said, her head resting against his shoulder. "We should plant fruit trees come spring, maybe plum or apple, something that'll last past us." He turned to her, eyes dark in the starlight. "You already gave me what'll last past me." She lifted her hand to his chest. "And what's that?" He caught her fingers in his. "A home. A family. Your name beside mine." He kissed her then, slow and sure, and she answered with the kind of tenderness that only came from knowing what it meant to lose and choose again. In the weeks that followed, they planted early beans and cabbage, and Porter built a bench outside the new shed where Orin could whittle animals from scrap wood. The boy carved a bear first, then a fox, then a little cabin with a crooked door. By midsummer, the trees behind the house hummed with bees, and Odessa's hands were stained with blackberry juice from the bush Porter had cleared space for near the fence. She wore her hair braided now, wrapped up to keep the heat off her neck, and Porter often undid it in the evenings just to see it fall. One night, while thunder rumbled far off, Orin stood barefoot in the doorway, his arms crossed. "I want to take your name," he said to Porter. "If it's all right." Porter looked at Odessa, then stepped forward. "Only if you want it for your own, not because you think it'll make you more mine." "I already feel that way," Orin said. So they wrote it down together, and the mill clerk filed it neatly. And by the end of the month, Porter Whitlow stood tall beside his adoptive father, learning how to plane a board smooth enough for a table. The seasons turned, leaves fell, snow came and melted again. The cabin held firm through every storm. Odessa taught more women in the camp how to dry herbs for winter, and Porter was asked to speak at the logging council when the new safety rules were drafted. Orin grew into strength and thoughtfulness, never loud but always sure. He built a bench beside the trail where the eagle used to nest and sat there sometimes, watching the valley in silence. Years passed, not in leaps, but in the steady rhythm of work and weather and love. Odessa grew lines around her mouth from smiling, and Porter's hair turned silver at the temples. Still, each night, they sat together on the porch, their hands always finding each other without a word. And when the first apple tree bloomed just beyond the fence, its blossoms pale as breath against the spring sky, Odessa bent low to smell them, then turned to Porter and said, "We did this." He kissed her brow. "We're still doing it." And they were.